start-stop button a few times when we didn't want to. Unfortunately, only the focus magnification button is assignable in the menus, so you can't even swap them yourself. The rocker, however, is good, and the other assignable button just ahead of it, which by default is auto iris, is reasonably easy to push. The back of the camera features a gigantic vent with what looks like a fan inside, though we didn't hear any noise from it in our testing. The flip-out screen is only a 1/4 HD resolution, and for some reason we struggled to be confident we were in focus sometimes, despite magnification and zoom. Also, it's very hard to see as usual from camera right, despite it flipping up, and yes, often you do shoot interviews from that side if you're working solo. Only Canon have ever made a camcorder that solved this in the XF300, and it is a huge shame that others don't copy that useful facility. Okay, so much for the ergonomics. What about the picture quality? Here are some samples shot in MXF 422 50 megabits at 25p. We didn't use XAVC Longot because, ridiculously, our editing software, Sony's very own Vegas Pro, doesn't understand that version of Sony's XAVC. But you can see the samples are clear enough, crisp enough, and perfectly decent, which really is no surprise. On a camcorder of this pedigree, at this price point, frankly all 1080 HD video should be entirely acceptable without question. It really would be more of an issue to point out if it wasn't. And that's why we've focused on ergonomics more than anything in this review, because the pictures are fine, so it's more relevant really to discuss how usable the camcorder is in day-to-day life. So on that front, one operational gripe we have is the loss of the PMW200's excellent depth of field indicator, which is replaced with this inferior sharpness bar. It's also placed irritatingly high into the middle of the picture. The longer the bar, the more the camera thinks the centre of the image is focused, which is all very well, but the depth of field indicator was invaluable and should definitely be included here. There's a fair bit of configuration in the menus, although if you want to store multiple setups, you have to save them to card. You can't just have several profiles and switch between them. We also found the operation of the menus to be really sluggish, and in fact that extended to several of the controls on the camcorder generally. You'd press a button and there'd be a fractional delay before anything happens, not something we've encountered on any Sony camcorder until this one. Perhaps a firmware update will cure it. We were on firmware version 1. Speaking of sluggishness, the startup time of this camcorder was appalling. A PMW200 is ready to go in 3 seconds, a Z5 in 6. This one takes 12, and by that time your shot could have gone away. One aspect of the camcorder that does impress is low light performance. Take this shot as an establisher with 0 dB gain with the iris fully open. Here's the same shot on a PMW200, which has half-inch sensors, remember, and here again on the trusty old Z5. Now let's bump the gain up to 18 dB. It's much brighter of course, but that's just amplification, so what? The real story is the lack of noise in the image, especially when you compare it to the Z5 at 18 dB. The X180 is a huge leap forward, and it compares remarkably to the PMW200 as well, with the X180 having arguably a smoother image. Sony have included a version of their active stabilization in this camcorder, a first we think for this size of unit. Here's what will zoom. This is without stabilization. Here's standard. And this is active. One thing you need to be aware of is how the image can soften when you're at either end of the iris. Here's a pic at f5.6. We have blown this up several times to make the effect more visible on YouTube. Here's the same image at f2.4. Now compare those with when we open the iris to f1.6 and it softens substantially. Those who use it, or for those panic-stricken catch the shot moments. You can see here that where there's a clear subject it snaps into focus quite fast. But on this example, the camera first finds focus on the posts and takes a little while doing so, then goes past them and locks onto the chairs. So not bad, but you might need to go manual sometimes. In conclusion then, we like the 25x optical zoom, the variable ND, the low light performance, the raised locators on the assign buttons, and the choice of codecs. We dislike the awful on-screen flashing warnings, the 12-second startup time, the slight lag on the controls, some of the ergonomics, the sheer size of the unit, and the lack of the depth of field indicator. Overall though, it's a decent enough camcorder for the jobs it's intended for. Thank you for watching. If this video was useful, please do click on that like button, and if you're not already a subscriber to the channel, please click subscribe as well, so YouTube will tell you when new videos are uploaded. Bye bye. This is Sony's PXW X180 camcorder. It's identical to the PXW X160, except that it adds GPS and Wi-Fi. They're the latest in a long line of news-gathering, fly-on-the-wall documentary and event camcorders, which began with the legendary Z1 and went through the Z5, EX1 and so on. At the front, there's a Sony G-series lens with a whopping 25 times optical zoom. That's very handy for the kind of applications this camera's used for, where you might not always be able to get close to whatever you've been tasked with filming. And it's 26mm equivalent at the wide end, which isn't bad either. As on the EX1 and PMW 200, this model has a two-position focus ring. Forward spins like the old Z5. Backwards gives you end stops from 0.8 of a metre to infinity, with markings in feet and metres on the barrel. There's a printed reminder of which way is which underneath. The zoom is switchable from servo to manual control using a tiny toggle underneath. In manual, you can set it with the middle lens ring. Servo is driven by either a small rocker on top of the handle or by the traditional two-finger rocker on the main hand grip. There's also lank control via a 2.5mm jack, which is handy. As usual, Sony's flip-up, flip-down lens cover is included, which helps keep muck off the glass while you're moving about. The iris is set via the third lens ring, and immediately behind that lies the usual ND switch, but actually not so usual, as the amount of ND for each of the three positions can be set in the menus. And if this switch is toggled to variable, the ND can be dialed in exactly how you want using the thumb wheel below. This means that you can afford to keep the iris open and set exposure using the ND, thereby helping you get a shallower depth of field. Here's a couple of examples. This shot is f3.4 at ND 1/4. When you open up to f2 and use the variable ND, the background goes a little more defocused. But remember, this camcorder uses 3rd-inch chips, so depth of field is always likely to be pretty deep. Here's another example at f4, just notice how blurry the bins and posts are. Then at f2.4 we get a little more fuzziness in the background. Now we couldn't open the iris any more at this zoom level because the iris ramps down the more you zoom in. Behind the lens lie 6 assignable buttons, and Sony's helpfully raised the centre of the middle 2 buttons so you can find them by touch. Likewise, the top button has a raised circumference, so you also know which row of buttons your fingers are on. It means you don't have to look up from what you're filming when you want to adjust something. But one moan we have about this camcorder is that every time you change a setting, apparently unswitch-offable, gigantic flashing banners come up on the screen, whether you're altering gain, zebra peaking, white balance or so on. Sony, we know things are changing, partly because we just pressed the switch to make it so, but also because it then tells you on the screen in the icons round the edges, as you'd expect. Anyone who doesn't realise what they're doing when they change the settings isn't going to be any the wiser to have big flashing warnings coming up, and it just gets in the way of seeing what you're shooting. This definitely needs the option to be switched off. At the bottom, the usual toggles for manual or auto iris, 3 levels of gain, 2 push-to-set white balance options plus a preset, and controls for accessing and scrolling through the menus. More auto on-off controls above that, plus shutter and a status button. Finally, on this side of the camcorder, audio controls for 2 channels, including input assignment and auto or manual volume. A 3.5mm headphone jack is usefully presented on the back of the top handle, and the output to that can be set to either channel 1, 2 or a stereo feed of both. An internal microphone sticks out of the front of the handle, and it does a decent enough job even if it's a bit windy. But a proper mic will always do much better. Hence, there's a standard shotgun mounting on the right-hand side. Below that lie the two balanced XLR audio inputs with little flaps over them, which we just found to be annoying but require a sharp knife to get rid of. Each input can be mic or line level with the option of 48-volt phantom power as you'd expect. On the back, a large eye-cupped viewfinder which can tilt up by 90 degrees for those awkward shots. This camcorder uses expensive but reliable S/S media for video storage. There is an SD card slot for saving your camera setup, and USB for getting the files off. It shoots not only in the time-honoured XDCam EX formats, but also two flavours of Sony's XAVC format, an interframe and a long GOP variant. It also does AVC HD and even good old DV. Batteries are the usual BPU type, and there's plenty of output options on the back: HDMI, SDI, Genlock and timecode, and another SD card slot which is for video for low-res proxy files. This being the X180 version, there's a tiny slot for a wireless dongle on the side that's for remote control via a tablet or smartphone, and with the latest firmware, streaming and file transfer. We like that Sony have put the on-off button back on the hand grip rather than on the end of the camcorder as it was on the PMW 200. While the position of the hand grip is good for weight and balance, we thought the focus magnification and last clip review buttons should have swapped places. Our fingers easily lay on the clip review button while filming, which you don't need, but had to strain backwards to hit the focus magnifier, which you do. And we had to brace with the thumb, which meant nearly hitting the record start stop button a few times when we didn't want to. Unfortunately, only the focus magnification button is assignable in the menus, so you can't even swap them yourself. The rocker, however, is good, and the other assignable button just ahead of it, which by default is auto iris, is reasonably easy to push. The back of the camera features a gigantic vent with what looks like a fan inside, though we didn't hear any noise from it in our testing. The flip-out screen is only a 1/4 HD resolution,